The lunch money was still there. 2 crumpled dollar bills and 37 cents in change, tucked carefully in the front pocket of Brian Kelly's discarded jacket. It was this detail that would haunt Detective Ray Kowalski for the next 3 decades, because children don't abandon their lunch money. They don't leave their bicycles lying on their side by the swing set with the back wheel still spinning in lazy circles. And they certainly don't vanish into thin air on a Tuesday afternoon in broad daylight with a dozen other kids playing nearby. September 17th, 1991. The kind of perfect Florida afternoon that makes parents grateful to live in Jacksonville, where the humidity finally breaks and the sun filters through Spanish moss like golden honey. Riverside Park buzzed with the usual after-school energy. Children's laughter echoed off the old oak trees. Mothers pushed strollers along the walking paths, and the playground equipment gleamed under a cloudless sky. Brian Kelly had arrived at 3:47 p.m., according to Mrs. Patterson, who lived across Riverside Avenue and made it her business to monitor the comings and goings of neighborhood children from her front porch rocker. 8-year-old Brian was a creature of habit. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd pedal his red Huffy bicycle the 4 blocks from Stockton Elementary School to meet his best friend Danny Morrison at the playground. They'd spend exactly 1 hour playing on the monkey bars, racing around the perimeter fence, and trading baseball cards under the pavilion. Brian's mother, Margaret, had drilled the routine into him with military precision. 1 hour, no longer. Home by 5 o'clock sharp for dinner. But on this particular Tuesday, Danny Morrison never showed up. His mother had kept him home with a stomach bug, something the Kelly family wouldn't learn until much later. So Brian played alone, swinging higher and higher on the old metal swing set, his sneakers pumping toward the canopy of leaves above. Mrs. Patterson remembered thinking how solitary he looked, how small against the vast expanse of the park. The first sign something was wrong came at 4:15 p.m., when Brian's bicycle was found lying on its side near the swing set. The chain had come loose, dangling in the dirt like a broken promise. His jacket, a navy windbreaker with his initials embroidered in yellow thread, was draped over the picnic table bench. Inside the pocket, investigators would later catalogue those bills and coins with the methodical precision that marks the beginning of every mystery that refuses to solve itself. What happened in those crucial 28 minutes between Mrs. Patterson's last sighting of Brian on the swings and the discovery of his abandoned belongings would become the central question of one of Jacksonville's most enduring cold cases. The playground surveillance camera had been broken for 6 months, its dark eye staring blindly at the scene where a little boy simply ceased to exist. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses to the precise moment when Brian Kelly stepped out of the world of the living and into the realm of the missing. If you're drawn to stories like these, stories where ordinary afternoons turn into lifelong nightmares, then you understand why some mysteries demand to be told. Subscribe to follow this investigation, because what we uncovered in those dusty case files will challenge everything you think you know about how quickly a life can disappear. The evening shadows were already stretching across the playground when Margaret Kelly arrived at 5:30 p.m., expecting to find her son waiting by the park entrance with his usual sheepish grin and some excuse about losing track of time. Instead, she found his bicycle, his jacket, and a growing knot of fear in her stomach that would never fully disappear. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office received the missing child report at 6:42 p.m., exactly 2 hours and 55 minutes after Brian Kelly was last seen alive. Those crucial early hours, investigators knew, could mean the difference between a child found safe and a case that haunts a community forever. Detective Ray Kowalski had worked missing persons cases for 12 years, and he understood the statistics better than most. After 3 hours, the odds begin their merciless decline. After 24 hours, hope becomes a luxury most families can no longer afford. Margaret Kelly's voice cracked over the emergency dispatch line, her words tumbling together in a desperate cascade of details that painted the picture of every parent's worst nightmare. Brian was 8 years old, 4 feet 2 inches tall, wearing a red Miami Hurricanes t-shirt and blue jeans. He had sandy brown hair that stuck up in the back no matter how much she combed it, and a gap between his front teeth that made him whistle when he said words with the letter S. He was supposed to be home by 5 o'clock. He was never late, never. Within 40 minutes, Riverside Park was transformed into a crime scene that pulsed with urgent activity. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the playground with yellow tape that snapped and fluttered in the evening breeze. Kowalski arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the abandoned swing set where Brian had last been seen. The detective's first impression was how eerily normal everything looked. Children's toys scattered in the sandbox, a forgotten juice box beside the slide, the faint chalk outline of hopscotch squares drawn on the concrete pavilion. It was a tableau of interrupted childhood, frozen at the exact moment when innocence encountered something unthinkable. The initial canvass of the neighborhood began immediately. Deputies knocked on every door within a 6-block radius, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they searched yards, storage sheds, and any place an 8-year-old boy might hide or be hidden. Mrs. Patterson provided the most detailed timeline, her practiced eye for neighborhood activities proving invaluable. She had seen Brian arrive at 3:47 p.m., watched him swing alone for nearly 30 minutes, then turned away to answer a phone call from her daughter in Atlanta. When she looked back toward the park at 4:30 p.m., the playground appeared empty. By 9 p.m., the search had expanded to include every available deputy, along with volunteers who seemed to materialize from the darkness, like moths drawn to the harsh glow of the mobile command unit. Margaret and Tom Kelly stood at the edge of the activity, their faces illuminated by the rotating red and blue lights of patrol cars, watching strangers search for their son with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this before. Too many times before. The K-9 unit arrived just after midnight, German shepherds straining against their leashes as they followed scent trails that led from the playground to Riverside Avenue, then simply vanished. The dogs circled in confused patterns, whimpering with frustration at losing the trail at the exact point where the asphalt met the grass. It was as if Brian Kelly had been lifted directly from the park into thin air, leaving no trace for even the most sensitive noses to follow. As dawn broke over Jacksonville on September 18, 1991, the search had expanded to encompass a 2-mile radius. Helicopters from the Florida Highway Patrol thundered overhead, their rotors beating against the morning sky like mechanical heartbeats. News vans began arriving from local television stations, their satellite dishes reaching toward the heavens as if trying to broadcast Brian Kelly's story to God himself. Detective Kowalski stood in the growing light of that first morning, surveying the controlled chaos of a missing child investigation, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Somewhere in this sprawling city of nearly 700,000 people, an 8-year-old boy was either hiding, lost, or in the hands of someone who meant him harm. The detective had no way of knowing that this case would consume the next 3 decades of his career, or that the answer would come from a place no one thought to look. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Ray Kowalski's desk had become a graveyard of leads that led nowhere. File folders stacked in precarious towers threatened to topple with each frustrated movement, their manila surfaces stained with coffee rings and the accumulated sweat of sleepless nights. The Brian Kelly case had consumed every waking hour since that September evening, and the detective was beginning to understand why seasoned investigators developed the 1,000-yard stare he'd noticed in his colleagues who worked cold cases. The registered sex offender interviews had yielded nothing but alibis and the familiar dance of denials. Kowalski had personally questioned 43 men within a 20-mile radius of Riverside Park, their faces blending together in his memory like a rogue's gallery of failed possibilities. Each interview followed the same pattern: initial defiance, grudging cooperation, and ultimately verifiable alibis that placed them nowhere near the playground on September 17th. The most promising suspect, a drifter named Carl Brennan who had been spotted near elementary schools, had been locked up in the Duval County Jail on a drunk and disorderly charge the entire week of Brian's disappearance. The witness statements painted a frustrating picture of conflicting details that seemed to shift with each retelling. Mrs. Patterson remained consistent in her timeline, but her description of a possible suspicious vehicle had evolved from maybe a dark van to possibly a blue pickup truck to, "I can't be certain I saw anything unusual at all." A jogger claimed to have seen a man talking to a child near the park entrance around 4 p.m., but under careful questioning, admitted the child might have been a girl, the man might have been a teenager, and the time could have been anywhere between 3:30 and 4:30. The physical evidence was equally elusive. The crime scene technicians had processed Brian's bicycle and jacket with meticulous care, dusting for fingerprints that belonged only to the boy himself and his parents. The loose bicycle chain showed no signs of tampering, appearing to have simply slipped off during normal play. Even the playground equipment yielded nothing beyond the expected collection of prints from countless children who had touched the monkey bars and swing chains over the years. Detective Kowalski found himself returning to the park at the same time each afternoon, standing where Brian Kelly had last been seen, trying to understand how a child could simply cease to exist in broad daylight. The playground had become a shrine of sorts, with flowers and teddy bears appearing daily at the base of the swing set. Local news crews had moved on to other stories, but the community continued to gather here, as if collective hope could somehow resurrect the missing boy from the silence that had swallowed him whole. The FBI had been consulted in the second week, their behavioral analysis unit providing a profile that could have described.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
Half the predators in Florida. The perpetrator was likely a white male between the ages of 25 and 45, possibly familiar with the area, comfortable enough with children to approach them without causing immediate alarm. It was useful in theory, but in practice, it narrowed the suspect pool to approximately 50,000 men in the greater Jacksonville area. By October 8th, 3 weeks after Brian's disappearance, the daily search teams had dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers and increasingly frustrated family members. The helicopters no longer thundered overhead. The command post had been dismantled. The case was settling into the bureaucratic rhythm of a long-term investigation, with weekly progress reports that documented the absence of progress with clinical precision. Detective Kowalski sat in his car outside the Kelly family home on Elm Street, watching the windows where no lights burned anymore. The house seemed to have absorbed the grief of its occupants, its once cheerful yellow siding now appearing faded and neglected. The detective knew what was happening inside those darkened rooms, had seen it in dozens of families whose children had simply walked out of the world without explanation. The waiting was eating them alive, one silent dinner at a time. The first crack in the Kelly marriage appeared 6 weeks after Brian's disappearance, during what should have been a routine conversation about grocery shopping. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, mechanically washing the same plate for the third time, when Tom suggested they might need more milk. The explosion that followed surprised them both with its ferocity. Margaret hurled the plate against the kitchen wall, ceramic shards scattering across the linoleum floor like fragments of their former life, and screamed that she didn't care about milk, didn't care about groceries, didn't care about anything except finding their son. Tom Kelly had always been the steady one, the pragmatist who paid bills on time and kept the lawn mowed with geometric precision. But the disappearance of his firstborn had revealed fault lines in his character that he hadn't known existed. He retreated into routine, as if normalcy could somehow summon Brian back home. He went to work every morning at the insurance office, processed claims with robotic efficiency, and came home to a house that felt like a mausoleum. When Margaret accused him of caring more about maintaining appearances than finding their son, he had no defense because part of him wondered if she was right. The dining room had been transformed into Margaret's command center, its mahogany table buried under stacks of photocopied flyers, boxes of safety pins, and detailed maps of Jacksonville, marked with colored pushpins indicating where Brian's picture had been posted. She had distributed over 3,000 flyers in 2 months, her hands permanently stained with ink from the copy machine at Kinko's. The manager there, a kind woman named Rosa, had stopped charging Margaret for copies after the first week, understanding that this was how a mother fights the unthinkable. Margaret's obsession with the flyers had grown beyond reason. She would drive to businesses where she had already posted Brian's picture, checking to make sure the papers hadn't been removed or covered by newer announcements. She kept a log of every location, every conversation, every promise from store managers to keep the flyers visible. When she found one that had been torn down or had faded in the Florida sun, she would replace it immediately, as if Brian's life depended on the continuous presence of his 8-year-old school photo smiling from every available surface in Jacksonville. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, had become a ghost in her own home, tiptoeing through rooms where any sound above a whisper seemed like sacrilege. She had stopped asking when Brian was coming home after the first month, having learned through the painful trial and error of childhood that this question made Mommy cry and Daddy leave the room. Instead, she set a place for her brother at every meal, a ritual that Margaret encouraged and Tom endured with visible suffering. The untouched plate would sit there through dinner, a ceramic monument to absence that made every bite taste like dust. The extended family had rallied initially, bringing casseroles and offers of help that gradually diminished as weeks turned to months. Margaret's sister Carol still called every few days, but the conversations had devolved into awkward recitations of non-news and gentle suggestions that perhaps it was time to consider grief counseling. Tom's brother had stopped visiting altogether after Margaret accused him of giving up on Brian during a Thanksgiving dinner that had dissolved into accusations and tears. The Kelly house had developed its own geography of grief. Brian's room remained exactly as he had left it on September 17th, his unmade bed waiting for his return, his homework assignment still spread across the desk, where he had abandoned long division problems that would never be completed. Margaret dusted the room religiously, but changed nothing, creating a shrine to interrupted boyhood that smelled of stale air and dying hope. Tom couldn't enter the room at all, passing the open doorway with averted eyes as if looking inside might turn him to stone. Sleep had become their enemy. Margaret lay awake listening to every sound, convinced that each creaking floorboard or settling timber might be Brian trying to come home. She had developed the habit of walking through the house at 2 a.m., checking locks and windows with the paranoid precision of someone who had learned that safety was an illusion. Tom retreated to the garage, sleeping on a cot among his tools and paint cans, claiming he didn't want to disturb Margaret's rest, but really unable to bear the sight of her lying rigid with hope beside him. The marriage was dying by degrees, suffocated by the weight of unanswerable questions and the terrible mathematics of blame that families discover when tragedy strikes without explanation. By the winter of 1995, 4 years after Brian Kelly's disappearance, the case file had migrated from Detective Kowalski's active desk to a grey metal cabinet in the basement of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The folder had grown thick with supplemental reports, witness re-interviews, and the accumulated detritus of false hopes. Anonymous tips still trickled in sporadically, usually triggered by age-progressed photos that appeared in the local newspaper on the anniversary of Brian's disappearance. But each lead dissolved under investigation like sugar in rain. Detective Kowalski had requested transfer to the robbery division in 1994, unable to bear the weight of Brian Kelly's unsolved case any longer. His replacement, a younger detective named Marcus Webb, inherited the file with the dutiful resignation of someone who understood he was being handed a career-defining failure. Webb conducted perfunctory follow-ups on the occasional tip, but the case had settled into the bureaucratic limbo reserved for investigations that had exhausted all reasonable possibilities. The Brian Kelly file became a teaching tool for new detectives, an object lesson in how thoroughly a child could vanish despite every resource being deployed to find him. Jacksonville was growing at an explosive pace during the mid-1990s, its population swelling with retirees and young families drawn by economic opportunity and year-round sunshine. New subdivisions sprouted like mushrooms after rain, their cookie-cutter houses filled with residents who had never heard of Brian Kelly. Riverside Park underwent a renovation in 1996, its old metal playground equipment replaced with modern plastic structures in bright primary colors. The swing set where Brian had last been seen was hauled away by city workers who had no idea they were dismantling the last physical connection to one of the area's most haunting mysteries. The Kelly family had dissolved like salt in water. Margaret and Tom divorced in 1993, their marriage finally succumbing to the corrosive effects of unresolved grief and mutual blame. Margaret moved to Atlanta to live with her sister, taking Sarah with her and leaving behind a house on Elm Street that Tom couldn't bear to enter, but couldn't bring himself to sell. The building sat empty for 2 years, its windows dark and lawn overgrown, before Tom finally accepted an offer from a young couple who had no knowledge of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Margaret's obsession with finding Brian had evolved into a different kind of torment. She joined support groups for parents of missing children, traveling to conferences in cities across the Southeast, where she would share Brian's story with audiences of similarly devastated families. The flyers had been replaced by a website she maintained with religious dedication, updating it weekly with age-progressed photos and pleas for information that generated fewer responses each year. She carried Brian's school picture in her purse, the paper worn soft at the edges from constant handling, and showed it to strangers in grocery stores and gas stations with the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen her son. The media attention had long since evaporated. Brian Kelly's story no longer generated ratings or newspaper sales, relegated to occasional anniversary pieces that ran buried in the metro section beside reports of city council meetings and high school sports scores. A generation of Jacksonville children had grown up with no knowledge of the boy who had vanished from Riverside Park, his disappearance becoming just another piece of local folklore that parents whispered to each other at PTA meetings as a cautionary tale about vigilance. Other cases had captured the public imagination during those intervening years. The O.J. Simpson trial dominated headlines in 1995. The Atlanta Olympic Park bombing shocked the nation in 1996. Brian Kelly's fate seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world that had moved on to newer tragedies and fresh mysteries. Even the most dedicated volunteers who had searched for him in those first desperate weeks had resumed their normal lives. Brian's memory preserved only in the occasional guilty pang when they drove past the park where it all began. By 1999, 8 years after Brian's disappearance, his case file resided in a storage room alongside hundreds of other cold cases, boxed and catalogued with the clinical efficiency of a morgue. The original investigators had retired or moved to other jurisdictions. The witnesses had scattered to other cities or simply forgotten the details that had once seemed so crucial. Jacksonville had become a different city, its population doubled, its skyline transformed, its collective memory wiped clean of an 8-year-old boy who had simply walked out of the world on a Tuesday afternoon and never returned. The year 2008 brought changes to law enforcement that would have seemed like science fiction to Detective Kowalski when he first investigated Brian Kelly's disappearance. The combined DNA index system had expanded exponentially, connecting crime labs across the nation in a digital web of genetic evidence that could link cases separated by decades and thousands of miles. Cold case units were emerging in police departments throughout Florida, their existence justified by the remarkable clearance rates being achieved through DNA analysis of evidence that had been considered worthless just years earlier. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office in January 2008, fresh from a specialized training program in forensic genetics at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. She was 32 years old, methodical by nature, and possessed of the particular brand of obsessive patience required for cold case work. Her assignment was straightforward: digitize and review the unsolved cases that had accumulated in the department's storage rooms over the past 3 decades, prioritizing those with biological evidence that might yield DNA profiles suitable for database comparison. The basement storage facility resembled an archaeological dig site, with boxes stacked in towering columns that reached toward water-stained ceiling tiles. Each container held the remnants of someone's worst day: evidence bags filled with clothing, photographs documenting crime scenes long since altered by time and development, witness statements typed on manual typewriters whose ribbon had faded to pale gray ghosts of testimony. Morrison approached the task with systematic precision, creating a database that catalogued every case by year, type of crime, and available evidence. Brian Kelly's file emerged from Box 247C on a humid Tuesday morning in March 2008. Morrison lifted the manila folder with the same careful attention she gave to every case. But something about this particular file captured her imagination immediately. Perhaps it was the school photograph of an 8-year-old boy with sandy hair and a gap-toothed smile, or the handwritten notes that documented Detective Kowalski's obvious dedication to finding answers that had remained elusive. The case had the weight of unfinished business, the particular gravity that accumulates around mysteries that have resisted solution for nearly 2 decades. The evidence from Brian's disappearance was minimal, but intriguing. His jacket and bicycle had been processed for fingerprints in 1991, but DNA testing had been in its infancy then, expensive and unreliable for anything beyond the most obvious biological samples. Morrison requested that the items be reprocessed using current techniques, hoping that advances in forensic science might reveal traces of genetic material that 1990s technology had missed. The process would take months, but time was one resource that cold cases possessed in abundance. While waiting for laboratory results, Morrison began reconstructing the investigation from the beginning, creating digital files from faded typewritten reports and scanning crime scene photographs into high-resolution images that revealed details invisible to investigators using 1990s technology. She interviewed retired detectives, tracked down witnesses who had scattered across the country, and built a comprehensive timeline that mapped every hour of those first crucial days when Brian Kelly had vanished from the world. The cold case unit operated with a different rhythm than active investigations. Morrison could spend weeks pursuing a single lead, following paper trails that stretched across multiple states and decades. She had clearance to request records from other agencies, access to databases that hadn't existed when Brian disappeared, and the luxury of perspective that comes from examining events through the lens of accumulated time. What had seemed like random occurrences in 1991 might reveal patterns when viewed alongside similar cases from other jurisdictions. Morrison's work attracted the attention of other cold case investigators throughout the Southeast. A network had emerged among detectives working decades-old mysteries, sharing information and techniques through conferences and online forums that connected cases across jurisdictional boundaries. The Brian Kelly disappearance was entered into a national database of missing children, cross-referenced with similar cases from other states, and analyzed for patterns that might suggest a serial predator had been operating in multiple locations. The revolution in forensic technology was revealing connections that had been invisible to earlier generations of investigators. DNA databases were solving cases from the 1970s and 1980s, linking criminals to crimes they had committed decades earlier when genetic evidence was science fiction. Morrison understood that she was working at the intersection of old mysteries and new possibilities, where the patient application of modern science to forgotten evidence might finally provide answers to questions that had tormented families for generations. The Kelly case had become more than just another file in her growing collection of digitized cold cases. It represented the possibility that justice, while delayed, might not be forever denied. The DNA report arrived on Detective Morrison's desk on a Thursday morning in October 2008, 17 years after Brian Kelly had vanished from Riverside Park. The laboratory technician had marked it as routine processing, one of dozens of evidence samples that moved through the state crime lab's backlog with bureaucratic efficiency. Morrison almost set it aside to read later, her attention focused on a more promising lead involving a similar disappearance in Tallahassee, but something about the thickness of the envelope made her pause, and she opened it immediately, spreading the technical analysis across her desk like a map to buried treasure. The results were startling in their specificity. Touch DNA extracted from the fabric of Brian's jacket had yielded a partial genetic profile, 13 markers that were insufficient for court presentation, but adequate for database comparison. The profile had been run through the combined DNA index system automatically, a routine process that compared unknown samples against hundreds of thousands of known offenders. Most searches returned negative results, but this one had generated a hit that made Morrison's pulse quicken with professional excitement and personal dread. Eddie Hutchinson. The name appeared on her computer screen with the clinical precision of digital certainty, accompanied by a booking photograph that showed a man with deep-set eyes and the weathered complexion of someone who spent his life on the road. Born in Valdosta, Georgia, in 1954. Multiple arrests for assault, drunk and disorderly conduct, and domestic violence stretching back to the 1970s, currently serving a 12-year sentence at Hayes State Prison in Tryon, Georgia, for aggravated assault on a convenience store clerk in 2005. The photograph was recent, showing a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and the hollow stare of someone who had spent too many years looking through prison bars. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the original case file, searching through witness statements and interview reports with desperate urgency. The name Eddie Hutchinson appeared on page 47 of Detective Kowalski's handwritten notes. A brief entry that documented a routine questioning session conducted on September 25, 1991. Hutchinson had been driving through Jacksonville on the day of Brian's disappearance, his 18-wheeler making a delivery to a wholesale furniture distributor on the city's north side. He had been cooperative during questioning, providing receipts and logbook entries that seemed to account for his whereabouts throughout the day. The interview had lasted less than 30 minutes, and Kowalski had noted that Hutchinson showed no obvious signs of deception or unusual nervousness. The original investigation had focused on local predators, men who lived in Jacksonville and would have been familiar with Riverside Park's layout and the rhythms of neighborhood children. A long-haul trucker passing through the city had seemed like an unlikely suspect, especially one who could document his presence at a legitimate business miles from the playground where Brian had vanished. Hutchinson had been crossed off the suspect list and forgotten, his name buried in the accumulating paperwork of a case that was consuming ever more resources without producing results. But 17 years of technological advancement had revealed what 1990s forensic science could not detect. Somehow, Eddie Hutchinson's DNA had ended up on Brian Kelly's jacket. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. Morrison understood that she was looking at evidence that could finally answer the question that had tormented a family and haunted a community for nearly 2 decades. The man whose genetic signature had been extracted from a missing child's clothing was currently locked away in a Georgia state prison, serving time for a violent crime that demonstrated his capacity for harming others. Morrison sat in her office as afternoon shadows lengthened across her desk, staring at the DNA report and the prison booking photo of Eddie Hutchinson.
If you're a fan of mystery cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
The connection between this truck driver and Brian Kelly's disappearance raised more questions than it answered. But for the first time since she had inherited this cold case, she felt the electric thrill of being close to the truth. The challenge now would be building a case strong enough to ensure that justice, so long delayed, could finally be served. Detective Morrison's investigation into Eddie Hutchinson's background revealed a pattern that chilled her to the bone. The truck driver's employment records showed he had worked for Southeastern Freight Lines from 1987 to 1994, driving regular routes that crisscrossed Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. His logbooks, preserved in company files with the meticulous attention to detail required by Department of Transportation regulations, painted a picture of a man whose job provided perfect cover for predatory behavior. Hutchinson's routes took him through dozens of small towns and cities, each stop offering potential opportunities to identify and target vulnerable children. The breakthrough came when Morrison discovered a witness statement that had been misfiled in the original investigation. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who had lived on Riverside Avenue in 1991, had given a statement to Detective Kowalski's partner 3 days after Brian's disappearance. Her English had been limited at the time, and the interviewing officer had apparently struggled to understand her account of seeing a large truck parked near the park entrance on September 17th. The statement had been typed as received, full of grammatical errors and fragmented sentences that made it difficult to follow. It had been filed incorrectly and essentially forgotten, buried in a stack of peripheral witness accounts that seemed to add nothing to the investigation. Morrison arranged for a Spanish-speaking detective to locate and re-interview Mrs. Vasquez, now 78 years old, and living with her daughter in Miami. The elderly woman's memory remained sharp, and her recollection of that Tuesday afternoon was surprisingly detailed. She remembered the truck clearly because it had been parked illegally, blocking her view of the park from her front window, where she liked to sit and watch the children play. The vehicle was white with blue lettering on the side, and she had been annoyed enough to consider calling the police about the parking violation. But by the time she had found the phone number, the truck was gone. The description matched the paint scheme used by Southeastern Freight Lines in 1991. Morrison obtained the company's delivery records for September 17, 1991, and found that Eddie Hutchinson had indeed made a delivery to Patterson Furniture Warehouse on Jacksonville's north side that morning. His logbook showed arrival at 9:30 a.m. and departure at 11:45 a.m., which should have placed him well outside the city by the time Brian Kelly disappeared from Riverside Park at approximately 4:15 p.m. But Morrison's experience with cold cases had taught her to question every assumption, particularly those made by investigators working under the pressure of an active missing child case. She requested Hutchinson's cellular phone records from 1991, a technology that was relatively new at the time and had not been routinely examined during the original investigation. The records took weeks to locate in archived files, but when they finally arrived, they told a story that contradicted Hutchinson's documented timeline. Cell tower data showed that Hutchinson's phone had remained connected to towers in the Jacksonville area until 4:47 p.m. on September 17th, more than 5 hours after he claimed to have left the city. The final ping before the phone went dark came from a tower that provided coverage to the Riverside neighborhood, placing Hutchinson in the immediate vicinity of the park at precisely the time when Brian Kelly vanished. Morrison cross-referenced this information with traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, a technology that was just beginning to be implemented in major cities during the early 1990s. The images were grainy and difficult to enhance, but she was able to identify a white truck matching Southeastern Freight Line's specifications, traveling on Park Street at 4:20 p.m., just 5 minutes after Brian's bicycle had been found abandoned at the playground. The circumstantial evidence was building into a compelling narrative. Hutchinson had lied about his departure time from Jacksonville, placing himself in the area when Brian disappeared. His DNA was on the boy's jacket. A witness had seen his truck parked near the playground. Cell phone records confirmed his presence in the neighborhood at the crucial time. Each piece of evidence might have been explicable individually, but together they formed a chain of connection that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Morrison prepared her report with the careful attention to detail that cold case prosecutions required. She knew that any eventual trial would scrutinize every aspect of her investigation, looking for procedural errors or evidentiary gaps that defense attorneys could exploit. The case would ultimately rest on the DNA evidence, but the supporting circumstantial evidence provided the context needed to transform a genetic match into a coherent theory of guilt. After 17 years of questions without answers, the Brian Kelly case finally had a suspect whose connections to the crime could not be easily explained away. The drive to Hays State Prison took Detective Morrison through the rolling hills of northwest Georgia, past cotton fields and pine forests that seemed to stretch endlessly under an overcast December sky. She had made this journey twice before to interview Eddie Hutchinson, but today carried the weight of finality that comes with solid evidence and a district attorney's blessing to pursue murder charges. The DNA match, combined with the cell phone records and witness testimony, had given her enough leverage to approach Hutchinson not as a person of interest, but as a suspect who faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. The interview room at Hays State Prison was a study in institutional bleakness, its concrete walls painted the color of old bones and scarred by decades of desperate conversations between inmates and their visitors. Hutchinson entered wearing orange prison scrubs that hung loosely on his diminished frame, his hands shackled with chains that rattled against the metal table as he settled into the plastic chair across from Morrison. At 54, 17 years in various correctional facilities had carved deep lines around his eyes and given his skin the pallor of someone who rarely saw sunlight. Morrison had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a suspect was ready to break. Hutchinson's body language had changed since their previous interviews, his defiant posture replaced by the slumped resignation of someone who understood that his carefully constructed lies were finally crumbling under the weight of scientific evidence. She placed Brian Kelly's school photograph on the table between them, the same image that had haunted Jacksonville for nearly 2 decades, and watched Hutchinson's reaction with the practiced attention of someone who had spent years studying human nature at its darkest moments. The confession came slowly, in fragmented sentences that Morrison had to piece together like shards of broken glass. Hutchinson spoke in a flat monotone that made his words even more chilling, describing how he had seen Brian playing alone at Riverside Park while making an unscheduled stop to use a payphone near the playground. The boy had been an easy target, isolated and trusting, approaching Hutchinson's truck when the driver claimed to be lost and needed directions. The abduction had taken less than 30 seconds. Brian lured close enough to be grabbed and pulled into the cab before anyone could witness what was happening. Morrison forced herself to maintain professional composure as Hutchinson described driving to a remote section of Duval County woods where he had taken Brian Kelly to die. The location was specific enough to guide search teams, a dirt logging road that branched off State Road 121, approximately 18 miles northwest of Jacksonville, marked by a distinctive lightning-struck pine tree that local hunters used as a landmark. Hutchinson had chosen the spot because of its isolation and because he was familiar with the area from previous deliveries to a lumber mill that had since closed. The most devastating revelation came when Hutchinson mentioned that he had been questioned by police 8 days after Brian's disappearance. Detective Kowalski had come within 3 questions of uncovering the truth, but Hutchinson's alibi documentation and cooperative demeanor had satisfied the investigators' suspicions. The original interview had been conducted at a truck stop on Interstate 75, and Hutchinson admitted that he had been terrified throughout the 30-minute conversation, certain that his lies would be detected. But Kowalski had thanked him for his time and moved on to other suspects, never realizing how close he had come to solving the case that would define the rest of his career. Morrison sat in stunned silence as Hutchinson provided details that only Brian Kelly's killer could have known, describing the boy's red Miami Hurricanes t-shirt, his gap-toothed smile, and the way he had whistled through his teeth when he said words that contained the letter S. The confession was being recorded, every word preserved for the prosecution that would finally bring justice to a case that had haunted Jacksonville for 17 years. As the interview concluded, Morrison understood that she was looking at evil in its most mundane form, a man whose ordinary appearance had allowed him to commit the unthinkable and return to his normal life as if nothing had happened. The arrest of Eddie Hutchinson on December 15, 2008, sent shockwaves through Jacksonville that reverberated far beyond the boundaries of Duval County. The news broke on a Tuesday evening, interrupted regular television programming with the kind of urgent bulletin usually reserved for natural disasters or terrorist attacks. Residents who had lived with the Brian Kelly mystery for 17 years found themselves struggling to process the revelation that the boy's killer had been identified, arrested, and was confessing to his crimes in a Georgia prison cell. The community's reaction was complex and often contradictory. Relief that the case had finally been solved mingled with anger that justice had been delayed for so long. Many residents expressed disbelief that a truck driver passing through their city could have committed such a heinous act and simply disappeared back into the anonymity of America's highways. The randomness of Brian's selection as a victim was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the revelation, destroying the comforting illusion that such tragedies happen for reasons that parents can understand and guard against. Margaret Kelly received the news at her home in Atlanta, where she had built a quiet life working as a school librarian and maintaining the website dedicated to her missing son. Detective Morrison made the call personally, her voice careful and professional, as she delivered information that Margaret had waited 17 years to hear. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but its impact would resonate through the remainder of Margaret's life. Brian's body had been found exactly where Hutchinson had indicated, buried in a shallow grave beneath decades of accumulated leaves and forest debris. The remains were too deteriorated for visual identification, but dental records confirmed what DNA evidence had already suggested. The trial began on March 15, 2010, in the Duval County Courthouse, drawing national media attention and filling every available seat in the gallery with reporters, victims' rights advocates, and Jacksonville residents who had never forgotten Brian Kelly's disappearance. Hutchinson's defense attorneys mounted a predictable challenge to the DNA evidence, arguing that 17 years of storage had compromised the genetic material and that the chain of custody was insufficient to guarantee reliability. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming in its thoroughness, presenting not just the scientific evidence, but the cell phone records, witness testimony, and Hutchinson's own detailed confession. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Margaret Kelly took the witness stand to deliver a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in absolute silence. She spoke about 17 years of not knowing, of birthday celebrations for a son who might be dead, of Christmas mornings when she still set aside presents that would never be opened. She described the dissolution of her marriage, the psychological trauma inflicted on Brian's younger sister, and the way an entire family had been destroyed by one man's decision to commit an act of unspeakable evil on a Tuesday afternoon in 1991. Hutchinson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on April 2, 2010. The judge's words were measured and final, describing the defendant's crimes as among the most heinous that had ever been prosecuted in Duval County. As the sentence was announced, Hutchinson showed no visible emotion, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression he had worn throughout the trial. Margaret Kelly wept quietly in the front row, her tears a mixture of grief for the son she had lost and relief that his killer would never harm another child. The resolution of Brian Kelly's case provided closure for a community that had lived with unanswered questions for nearly 2 decades. But that closure came at a price that could never be fully calculated. A family had been destroyed, a community's innocence had been shattered, and a little boy's life had been stolen by a stranger who simply happened to drive through Jacksonville on the wrong day. Justice had finally been served, but it arrived too late to repair the damage that 17 years of uncertainty had inflicted on everyone who had loved Brian Kelly. If you followed this investigation from the beginning, you understand why some stories demand to be told and retold until justice finally prevails. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below, and subscribe to ensure you never miss the resolution of mysteries that have waited too long for answers.